So as a philosopher, I tend to use text rather than images. So you'll see a lot of text up here. And you might be busy reading it or something like that. But I'll try to. Sometimes that works pretty well when you have a lot of people with different languages and they can see the text and read along with it. The other thing I should say is that I'm going to talk about phenomenology. And some of you already perhaps know some phenomenology, but I'm going to at least begin at a very basic level and assume that nobody knows anything about phenomenology, because I assume there are some people who know nothing about phenomenology. So that's a second apology to those who already know some of this stuff. And this notion of intentionality that I want to talk about came up before in the last couple of days. And I want to at least give you a phenomenological perspective on this notion. And in the first part of this, I want to talk about the notion of pre-reflective consciousness, or more precisely, pre-reflective self-awareness. Let me begin by saying that you are sitting there listening to me speak. I have three questions for you. The first is, did I actually have to tell you that, or did you already have some sense that you were sitting there listening to me speak? And after I told you, did you have to actually check in order to confirm whether I was right? You might say, oh, he just said, I'm sitting here listening to him. Let me see if that's correct. Am I sitting? Am I listening? There's another question that doesn't look like it might be related, but I'll try to show you that it is related. And it's this: how is it possible that you were able to understand my statement, or even the question I'm asking you now? All of these issues have to do with what I'm going to talk about, this notion of pre-reflective self-awareness. If you're trying to answer that last question, you might say, well, maybe I have to understand English. Maybe I have to be conscious and listen to what's being said. But there's another kind of question that you could ask which gets more to the topic, and that is, how exactly is consciousness structured such that I would be able to listen to a sentence and actually understand it? And that will have something to do with the temporal structure of consciousness, which is also tied into this notion of pre-reflective self-awareness. So here's an outline of what I'll try to get through. I'll talk a little bit about phenomenology, the term, and the kind of phenomenology that I'll be discussing is actually a historical philosophical approach to consciousness. And I'll try to make some clarifications there. But then we'll talk about one particular aspect of consciousness, intentionality, and then move on to this notion of reflective versus pre-reflective self-consciousness. And again, I mentioned the temporal structure of consciousness. We'll come to that. And then if we have time, I'll talk about this notion of the minimal self, which is tied into some of this. So phenomenology. In the broad consciousness studies literature, the term phenomenology is often used just as almost a synonym for consciousness itself. People talk about a person's phenomenology, a person's experience, a person's consciousness, basically. And what they are referring to, I think, primarily is what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, or qualia sometimes is a term used. We've seen that term before. Nagel gave us a nice phrase, what it is like to experience something. What is it like to taste chocolate as opposed to what is it like to see a red rose or something like that. So this is a common usage of the term phenomenology, but this is not the specific use of the term that I'm going to make. For me, today, when we're talking about phenomenology, we're talking about a philosophical approach to the study of consciousness that has a history to it going back to the early 20th century with the philosopher Edmund Husserl, who's usually regarded as the founder of the phenomenological school, And a number of people who followed him. Aaron Gurvitch was one of his students. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a French existentialist, phenomenologist. Many of you probably know Jean-Paul Sartre, also influenced by phenomenology. And there's a whole kind of movement, you might say. These are just some of the people, but Husserl being the main initiator of this school. In Husserl's view, he was responding to, I should say, by the way, Husserl was trained as a mathematician. He wasn't a philosopher. His PhD was in mathematics, and his first couple of books were about the philosophy of arithmetic and then logic at the very beginning of the 20th century. He was responding to the kind of positivism that you find, in, say, in the 19th century, which was a kind of scientism which was something like a claim that the only way to genuine knowledge is through science, that no other kind of knowledge is going to get you the truth. So science is it. One version of this was called psychologism, which was an attempt to show that we can understand everything that we need to know about consciousness, the mind, simply by through the science of psychology. And Husserl was a bit sensitive about this, especially with respect to mathematics, because he thought he was something of a Platonist. He thought that the meaning of mathematics was something independent of any particular person's psychological state. You can't reduce mathematical truth somehow or other to psychological states. Okay. So this was a setting that he was working in. So oftentimes phenomenology is viewed as being opposed to a kind of naturalism to science. It's not that it's opposed to science, however, it's just opposed to a certain set of claims about science. And in contemporary philosophy of mind, cognitive science, there's still a kind of ongoing scientism, now kind of reflected in kind of hardcore reductionist claims, like a claim like Francis Crick, for example, is famous for making, that you are nothing but a pack of neurons. Everything of importance is just your neurons. But there are others, like a philosopher, Thomas Metzinger in Germany, who basically says the self is nothing more than a self model that's generated by the brain. And there's nothing more to it. It's an illusion. And there's nothing real about the self, according to Metzinger. Another philosopher, Alvin Goldman, thinks that really, if you want to talk about embodiment and the role of embodiment in cognition, really all you need to pay attention to are the type of representations, he calls them B representations or body representations in the brain. So really just understanding the neural processes that relate to certain bodily phenomena is sufficient. And there are, I mean, we could go down the list, we could talk about free will and what happens to free will in this kind of approach and so forth. Phenomenology is in a certain way critical of that type of reductionism. They're not against science, as I say. They're not anti-science, they're anti-scientism, which is that kind of claim that says science is everything. So this is very clear in Husserl because Husserl was very concerned about science. He wanted to make sure that the epistemological foundations for science were correct. So he was worried that maybe when people did science, they weren't thinking deeply enough about, specifically about the structure of consciousness, for example. And so he proposed what he called a transcendental approach to consciousness, which was an attempt to say, before we take any kind of scientific assumptions or do any science about consciousness, we need to understand what consciousness is like and what the invariable structure of consciousness is. So this is also, I think, very clear that phenomenology is not anti-science when you look at some of the other people as well who came after Husserl. So Merleau-Ponty, if you're familiar with his work at all, you know that he does phenomenology, but he also is very concerned to understand the neuroscience of his time. He looked at neurological cases. Also, he was trained in psychology, especially developmental psychology. So he was mixing phenomenology with the sciences. Aaron Gurvich as well was looking at Gestalt psychology and thinking that phenomenology could very nicely be integrated with that type of approach. And more recently, there have been people who have been talking about naturalizing phenomenology, by which they mean a number of different things, and there have been a number of proposals about how to do that. But basically, it's the idea of how can we use phenomenology in scientific research? How can science and phenomenology in a certain way get together? This sometimes takes the form of asking, how can you integrate first-person data with third-person data? How can you talk about a person's experience, a person's consciousness from a first-person perspective? How can that kind of mesh with the objective third-person measurements that science needs to do? So various proposals have been made under the title of neurophenomenology, where you use phenomenological method within experiments. Other proposals have been that you do phenomenology and then you do the science, and then you find a kind of language to bring them together. And the language turns out to be mathematics, so that if you can find the right mathematics to characterize for example, the phenomenal experience you're having, then, and people have suggested dynamical systems theory might be that type of thing. Husserl himself, although trained mathematician, thought this was not the right way to go. But Francisco Varela and a number of people surrounding him, at least, considered this possibility. So the idea then is sort of an old idea that you get from navigation and survey of triangulation, and the idea has been proposed that when you do cognitive science, you have to do many disciplines together in some fashion. So you're doing neuroscience, you're doing some experimental psychology, and then the other idea is that phenomenology might be part of that mix of methodologies that you use in order to focus in on one thing that you're trying to understand, whether that's the mind or the self or consciousness and so forth. And of course, that's not everything. You also could, incorporate anthropology, developmental and social psychology, and so forth and so on. And of course, computational sciences as well. But then the question is, how do you get these disciplines together? How exactly do they mesh? I think it's easier said than done. It's a nice idea, this idea of triangulation. But it turns out that each science really comes with its own set of presuppositions and assumptions and ways of doing things that don't necessarily easily mesh together with the others. Yeah.
Is this, the previous slide, is this particular to the mind, and there's something about the mind that requires more than science, or could you say this about any kind of physical phenomena, or are most of them more or less captured by science? Do you need this?
Yeah, so I don't know if astronomy, I'm not quite sure. I don't think if you're studying the stars, you necessarily need experimental psychology or phenomenology. But when you're studying something like the human mind, right, or consciousness, and that's what we're dealing with here, then the claim is you need this kind of triangulation.
I think that one aspect here, you mentioning astronomy, is that what we are trying to do about consciousness is sort of like in the days of Copernicus in natural science. Around the time of Copernicus, there was the beginning of a paradigm shift, like maybe the Earth in the center, maybe not, who knows. No Newtonian mechanics, no mathematical formulation, no Kepler, no Galileo even. I think we are really in the beginning. We are just talking about what is consciousness. So if you compare consciousness studies with natural science, which is very well developed, then you have to realize what really happened when, after Copernicus, Galileo started looking through a telescope. And we think it is so silly that people refuse to look through the telescope. Like, There's a telescope, you can see the moon, you can see the moons of Jupiter. Why did some of the people from the church not want to look through it? But in a way, it is not quite fair. If you have a historical perspective, and if you come out of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance is something so completely new and nobody knows what are the foundations of knowledge and everything is up for grabs, then somebody comes with a few crummy lenses which you can barely make something of. I mean, if anybody has tried to make a telescope using glass lenses from glasses or something like that, you can see it's not that easy to get a good picture. So then somebody claims that you can see something new about reality by looking through this strange thing. It took time to find a paradigm of how to say what is real and what is not real. And in this diagram, I think it is very logically, almost mathematical. You have objective study of objects, you have an objective study of subjects, and you have a subjective way of looking at your own consciousness. Is that fair?
That makes sense. Yep.
I think like there is something very analogous to this. I might not like be familiar with phenomenology as much as everybody else, but it seems to me it's very analogous to like the idea of like thermodynamics, as like so neuroscience studies parts and how they come together, and experimental psychology looks at the whole like behavior of the whole brain. And then phenomenology wants to like come up with like a way of explaining all the experimental things you see in psychology. So it kind of looks like you have like all the particles interacting in a gas. You want to electrodynamics explain how the particles interact with each other and what they're made of, and then thermodynamics tell you what the entire system does. And so well, like a thermodynamical experiment and the laws of thermodynamics are like kind of phenomenology, right? So it doesn't like go down to deep down to like how molecules interact with each other, but it gives you what effectively a system does.
Yeah.
So I think this could be like something that it's been happening in science before.
I think that's a very nice analogy. On the top you would have the atomic description of, say, water. On the left you would have a Boltzmann description of how to derive thermodynamics, and on the right there would be thermodynamics as an intrinsic property. So I think it's a very fundamental triangle in probably every type of empirical science. Empirical means based on experience, and every experience has somebody experiencing something. It could be an apparatus measuring something. There are always three things involved. And of these three things, on the top is what is being measured, and on the left is a description of how to turn a subject into an object. And in the right, you really start from the measuring. It's a pure study of the measuring apparatus. This could be a human or a machine. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, you probably know what you're talking about. The thermodynamics, I'm not quite sure of, but yeah. So I think maybe we'll get a better idea as we go on to see maybe what we can do with phenomenology and what exactly it has on offer. As I say, it's not easy, right? There's different presuppositions that one uses in different sciences. There's a kind of division of labor in science that tends to resist interdisciplinarity. I mean, you talked about that in a way earlier. Also, experimental research obviously, requires controls, and there's a kind of a narrowing of focus, and sometimes you get the impression that phenomenology wants to widen the focus and try to consider as much as possible, which of course is difficult if you're doing experiments. And then once you have the data, then there's questions of how you correlate this stuff, how you get it together and make it meaningful. But I don't think there's any insurmountable problems in this regard. And if you can do it, and we're still kind of exploring ways to do it, but ultimately what I think you end up with is a kind of non-reductionist cognitive science, where you can talk about first-person experience in a meaningful way and make sense of it in terms of all the other scientific data as well.